Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. That line is one of the most famous in American history, and for good reason. But here's the thing. The Pearl Harbor whole shebang was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story exploded.
Maybe we shouldn't use the word shebang.
Shebang was an interesting choice.
I don't know where that came from.
And I also feel I should have said this opening line.
Oh. You know what? Let's back up and
right.
let's I want to hear you say
Do the
FDR.
rewind sound.
Do we have a rewind?
Oh, that was good. Wow.
Yeah, that's not bad.
All right.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Did he always yell?
Yeah.
Is that what?
Yeah,
Okay.
if you yeah.
Okay. All right.
She had to get the point across.
December 7th.
Oh yeah, we got it. I heard it.
So Pearl Harbor, indeed, was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story exploded, quite literally. The real story starts years earlier with a country wounded by World War I, suspicious of entanglements overseas, and determined, almost desperately determined, not to get pulled back into another global war.
And that's what makes this episode so important. This is not just a timeline from neutrality to war. It's a story about memory, fear, economics, and political choice. Why did so many Americans cling to isolationism? Why did Roosevelt move so cautiously? And why did Hitler rise when he did? And how did the United States go from let's all just stay out of it to fighting on 2 oceans and 2 continents?
And asking all of these questions, it takes all of us beyond just memorizing Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Hiroshima, because memorization doesn't lead to deeper historical thinking. It's a piece of it. But this is a causation story. It's a continuity and change story. And the United States wanted influence in the world, but after World War II, it wanted that influence without commitments, without alliances, and without another trench war catastrophe. So that balancing act, it worked for a while. And then the 1930s into the 1940s is going to make it impossible. All right, let's start with isolationism.
Yeah, but first I need to say something.
Okay. I need to adjust my microphone.
I clearly have a cold.
You do.
And I just want to
Oh,
apologize.
a man has a cold. We must stop the episode to address it. If you would like to send cards, well wishes,
Hey.
flowers,
Hey.
edible arrangements,
I
you can DM us in this difficult time.
Double ear infection. Didn't miss a single day. My students
That's
said,
not something to be proud of. I
students
keep
said,
telling you
"Oh,
that.
You're so tough, Mr.
No,
Garrison."
that's you have put other people in harm's way by being around them when
Yes.
you're sick.
No, I don't
It's not some badge of honor that you didn't miss any school for being sick.
I think people are pretty
You
impressed.
absolutely should not come to school when you don't feel well.
Well, here I am, making these podcasts happen for the audience.
You're watching basketball right now.
Well, not really.
Well,
Actually,
M-I-Z.
does this microphone?
ZOU.
Yeah, you just have to twist it.
Sounds like we're
I don't
underwater.
think this is gonna. You're making it. You literally made it worse.
It sounds like we're traveling in a submarine. This is underwater recording.
Okay, all right. That's good.
Mr. Fix It.
All right.
Mr. Fix
Sorry
It.
to the audience.
Now you
Okay.
guys germs all over.
All right.
your
Sorry to the
microphone.
audience.
Let's
Sorry to
start
the
with
audience.
isolationism.
Yes, okay, because some students sometimes hear that word and they imagine America just hiding under a blanket, right?
Everybody's got to have a blankie.
Yeah, but that's not really it.
Okay.
Isolationism in the 20s and 30s, it comes out of trauma, and that trauma is World War I. It had cost many lives, a lot of money, and people had lost faith in old promises. And so a lot of Americans believed that the war had not made the world safe for democracy, despite Woodrow Wilson saying that it would. And so they looked back and thought, we were sold this really noble cause, and we, in return, we got slaughter, debt, and disappointment.
Yeah, and then there was the bitterness over how the war ended, and the Senate rejects, League of Nations, and this was Wilson's baby, and the United States never joins the international body that was supposed to do the very thing of preventing the next war. So America was powerful, it was rich, it was globally involved, but also determined to stay free of binding commitments. It wanted influence without the entanglement.
By the 1930s, that sentiment had really deepened. The Nye Committee had investigated whether bankers and arms manufacturers had actually pushed the United States into World War I purely for profit. Historians are kind of skeptical of the most extreme versions of that claim because, as always, the realities are more complex. But really, at the time, the committee's findings landed hard with the public, and it just reinforced the belief that foreign wars served elites more than ordinary Americans.
And that's why the Neutrality Acts, plural, of the 1930s matter. They were not these random laws. They were memory turned into policy. And Congress wanted to make sure that the U.S. could not slide into another war the way that many people thought it had in 1917 through things like loans, shipping, trade, and gradual commitment. You know, we were allegedly neutral, but looking at it, we really weren't.
Yeah, we really were not. And we did some other, I don't know. I always think that this is kind of weird and useless. But anyway, this is where the Dawes Plan becomes crucial. So after World War I, Germany owed reparations because all the Allied countries just wanted to stick it to Germany, right? Under the Dawes Plan, the U.S. banks loaned money to Germany. Germany then used that money to pay Britain and France, and then Britain and France then used those payments to service their own war debts to the United States. It was just kind of like passing the trash, passing the cash.
Pass the trash. Pass the trash. Pass the debt. Pass the debt.
Graham and all of his buddies before school, they'd play a card game called Pass the Trash.
Pass the trash.
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
I was going to say pass the cash, and then trash came out because of that card game.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so anyway, it was just kind of this circular, passing off the money, and it's kind of weird. Do you guys think that's weird?
It was weird, but it did temporarily solve a lot of the financial problems. All of this relied on American credit. And at the time, the thought was, well, America is a great place to borrow money from. Certainly nothing will happen there. And so everybody's pretty confident in this circular financial system until the Great Depression hits. And then once again, we've got these American loans that are holding up everything. And when they dry up, the whole structure starts to collapse. You've got Germany's economy that was already pretty fragile after the war. Suddenly add to this political instability and the whole country goes into crisis. We've got massive unemployment and probably most importantly, fear and anger combined with humiliation. And that creates these conditions that allowed for extremist positions to take hold, which is why Hitler and the Nazi party all of a sudden, they seem kind of attractive to millions of desperate, angry voters. It doesn't mean that Hitler's rise was always inevitable, but it does mean that economic collapse certainly made his rise somewhat possible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think we should notice the irony, right? Even though we're not a part of the League of Nations, to Wilson's now dead body's dismay, yeah, he died. It's still shaped.
That was just a weird way to say it.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. I'm weird. Like the Dawes Plan, okay?
Much to his dead body's dismay.
Well, it killed him.
It did.
He was so
He
upset.
died of a broken heart.
Yeah. And so the irony is that we don't join the League of Nations, but we are still shaping Europe and global events through money. That America was never really absent from the world. It was involved without wanting to admit how involved it really was. And that was the truth from 1914 to 1917, too.
Yeah,
in terms of the war.
In a way, when we start talking about the Dawes Plan and the United States' economic relations with the world, it really helps us transition to Nazi Germany a little bit because, not that we want to spend too much time talking about the rise of Hitler, but briefly, we know that he became chancellor in January 1933 after the Nazi Party had grown through a lot of propaganda and the outbreaks of street violence. They'd formed these positions based on anti-communism, anti-Semitism, and made these promises of national rebirth. But the Great Depression was the accelerant. And when we say Great Depression, we mean the American Great Depression, which became an international depression. So when the economy collapsed, moderate politics kind of looks weak and takes the blame, whereas extremism starts to gain an audience.
And once the Great Depression hit, U.S. banks stopped lending abroad the way they had in the 1920s. And so when that flow of money dried up, Germany was in real trouble. Banks failed, hyperinflation took over. Businesses collapsed, unemployment exploded, families lost savings, jobs, and any confidence that the Democratic government could protect them. And so that's why this is a great global depression, not just a U.S. Great Depression.
So that's what we really need to see here, is that the Depression didn't just hurt Germany in some vague way. It really shattered their financial system, and that really had been propping Germany up. So the collapse will feel sudden, humiliating, terrifying, and these moments of chaos, extremism gains momentum, and promises to give everybody someone to blame.
Right. And so Hitler didn't just inherit power. He uses the crisis in a pretty brilliant way. He promises order to people terrified or chaos. If you think about it, there's a lot of parallels. He comes to power in early 1933. FDR comes to power in 1933.
Yeah.
And both of those individuals rose from a point of desperation.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the New Deal never even becomes a possibility, or the idea of a limited welfare state becomes a possibility without the chaos and desperation of the Great Depression.
Exactly. And so Hitler will go on to promise his people restoration to people, and he'll use the humiliation of Versailles, the fact that they had to sign a war guilt clause, and he'll use that. He promises action to people tired of parliamentary deadlock.
Which brings us to appeasement. And this is one of those APUSH adjacent European terms. Where my AP Euro people at? No one in this room, but maybe listening. And you hear it all the time, right? But we should define it clearly. Appeasement was the policy of trying to avoid war by conceding to some of Hitler's demands. And the classic moment of appeasement comes in Munich in 1938 when Britain and France accepted Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. So they were like, okay, no more. He had already annexed the Rhineland. Germany had already been remilitarizing, so multiple violations of the Treaty of Versailles. But they're like, okay, we're serious now, France and Britain, this no more than this. And if you give a mouse a cookie,
if you give Hitler Czechoslovakia,
he's gonna want Poland.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so now to be fair, the appeasement didn't come just out of stupidity. It really was out of fear, because Britain and British and French leaders, they had these deep scars from World War I. Their societies had not yet recovered. They weren't eager for any more war. Their militaries certainly weren't in a position to enforce any of the treaty's requirements, and their economies were in shambles. So appeasement was basically like this politics of exhaustion.
But of course, once Hitler swallows the rest of Czechoslovakia, the illusion cracks. Appeasement had not satisfied him, and it had taught him that the democracies were hesitant and divided. So where's Roosevelt in all this? He sees the danger earlier than much of the public, but he's kind of boxed in politically. He can't simply drag the country into war. So the path from neutrality to intervention becomes a very slow, almost improvised story.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, much like his fifth cousin once removed, Teddy, Franklin is an internationalist. They both want to see the United States be major players on the world stage, but he has to be cautious. He understands that public opinion is not quite there yet after World War I, and so he gives speeches warning about aggression, including a really famous one in 1937 now called the Quarantine Speech. But again, public reaction to this kind of talk is very hostile. Like, oh, we're oceans removed away from these issues in Japan and in fascist Europe, and so we don't want to go on crusades to save anybody. We want distance. So Roosevelt has to really work incrementally to change some of this.
But when Germany invades Poland in 1939, the war in Europe truly begins, and Roosevelt slowly begins pushing Congress to subtly revise neutrality so that the United States can sell arms on a cash and carry basis. And that sounds sort of technical, but it really represents a major shift because, yes, America is still officially neutral, But its neutrality now favors countries like Britain that can actually pay cash and then carry or transport those goods by sea.
Right. And then the shock of 1940. France falls. Dunkirk happens.
Did you really just have to do that into the mic?
I didn't mean to. I've been trying to strategically see.
You know what? I thought you were holding back tears because France had fallen.
Yeah, it's emotional.
It is emotional.
I'm trying my best.
You know, and we appreciate the effort.
When I think of Dunkirk, you know what I think of?
Harry Styles.
Exactly.
Let's go. Okay. Yeah, I could have called that one. Well, I guess I did call that one. So it's Britain and Britain alone that is standing up. So suddenly the Atlantic doesn't feel so wide. The pond is not such a big place. So Americans are watching London burn in the Blitz, and even people who do not want war begin to think Nazi victory would indeed change the world.
And Roosevelt responds with measures that completely stop making us look neutral in any meaningful sense. And it's called the Destroyers for Bases Plan. And this is a huge defense buildup. Basically, we allow destroyers, ship destroyers, to be sent to Britain for help and in exchange for leasing bases from them, basically. And this is also includes the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. And all the while, he still has to deal with something called the America First Committee, which was a group led by Charles Lindbergh, who were very against intervention in world affairs and wanted the United States to stay isolationist.
Yeah, old Lindbergh kind of thought the Nazis were onto something.
Yeah, right. Well, they invited him over.
Oh, yeah.
He inspected the Luftwaffe, and they gave him medals, and kind of creepy.
Be weird if a city
had a street named
named after him and a high school
named after him.
That'd be
so weird.
That'd be weird. So shout out to Lindbergh. I like Lindbergh. Okay, so wait a second. That sounded wrong. Shout out to Lindbergh Street is what I meant by that.
And Lindbergh
High School.
School District. Okay, okay, good.
Kirkwood got it right.
Yeah, they did.
Because they changed.
The street changes once it gets into Kirkwood
Road.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Okay. I had to make that clear. Okay, so that's the key tension, right? That we have this very real political debate between interventionists and the millions of Americans who think like, wait a second, we don't need to repeat World War I. It makes way more sense to stay safe and stay out of Europe's wars.
Right, but by late 1940 and early 1941, Britain is running out of cash, so Roosevelt finds another workaround, and this is Lend-Lease. And the United States will supply nations deemed vital to American defense, even if they can't pay up front. That is a huge conceptual leap. And so we're not at war, but we are now the arsenal behind one side in the war.
And then in August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, I think, are going to issue the Atlantic Charter. They all three sign it. And this lays out very broad goals for the post-war world, including self-determination and international cooperation. And again, August 1941, the United States is not in World War II at this point. So, I mean, yeah, we've totally abandoned neutrality, basically. And the United States, yeah, I said that line before I saw it on the script. But come on! A neutral nation does not usually draft the moral blueprint for the peace that is supposed to follow a war it is not fighting in.
That Harry Styles thing kind of shook you up a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
By fall 1941, neutrality is just basically threadbare. We've got U.S. naval patrols moving deep into the Atlantic. Roosevelt orders American ships to fire on German submarines on sight. And the U.S., not formally at war in Europe, it's drifting into an undeclared naval conflict. So when we ask this question of, well, when do we transition away from neutrality? The answer is legally one date, but practically it's a really messy process that happens over time.
And it's something that FDR was very aware of, that he's moving the country slowly through public opinion. So now we're going to pivot.
Time for a pivot.
To Japan. We're going to go to the Pacific because Pearl Harbor didn't just come out of nowhere either. Japan had been at war in Asia for years, especially in China. It invaded Manchuria in 1932 and then the rest of China in 1937, and it wanted empire, resources, and strategic dominance, and it really models itself off of the great European powers who had imperialized a century before. And so when Japan moved into French Indochina, that would be Vietnam, in 1941, the United States responded by freezing Japanese assets and cutting off access to American oil.
And that's a big deal because if you're going to build an empire, you need steel and you need oil. And wow. So it's naval power, air power, transport, empire. So Japan faced a brutal choice: back down and negotiate on American terms, or seize the resources it needed elsewhere, maybe in the Dutch East Indies.
So that's this larger context for Pearl Harbor that I don't think many Americans are fully aware of, that there's a story behind the story, because Japanese leaders were really hoping that a surprise strike would kind of take out the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to consolidate its empire in Asia and overall in the Pacific. And it's a gamble, really an enormous gamble, but it's grounded in this strategic calculation that if Japan is going to survive as an empire, it needs to take out America's resources.
Right. And then, of course, the day that FDR referred to earlier, December 7th, 1941, this is an attack that devastates Pearl Harbor. It kills more than 2,400 Americans, transforms public opinion overnight. It's no longer a question of whether or not we're going to stay neutral, right? So Roosevelt's speech the next day captures that shock perfectly. Congress declares war on Japan almost immediately.
But we should understand this, that declaring war on Japan didn't automatically mean that we were at war with Germany, because under the alliance that Germany, Japan, and Italy had, the Tripartite Act, it didn't require Germany to join if Japan had been the aggressor. So Hitler still, though, chooses to declare war on the United States on December 11th, and that decision turned an already enormous war into a fully global one for the United States. And the United States is not just fighting a two-front war like Germany had fought in World War I. This is now a two-theater war. We're in the European theater and the Pacific theater.
Right, not places that you eat popcorn in.
No,
Right, no, that's a term for where a war is fought.
Exactly. So in the Pacific, the United States faces a sprawling ocean war of carriers, marines, airfields, and these island campaigns, whereas in Europe and North Africa, we're joining a coalition with Britain and what's left of Free France. And eventually we ease into an uneasy partnership with the Soviet Union. All this means strategically the Allies are going to adopt a Germany-first approach, leaving the United States to worry about the Pacific kind of in the background, even though it's an urgent and brutal affair.
Do you need a tissue?
Yeah, I
'Cause we
I
can go
can't
get
breathe.
some.
I can't breathe through my nose.
You should have brought tissues in
I
here.
wish I would have. Hindsight.
Well,
I'll battle through this. Don't worry about me.
speaking
Oh,
of
it'll
battles,
it'll be just as intense as these battles we'll be talking about in World War II.
true. But before we run through all those, let's pause on something the attack helped to unleash at home, and that is fear.
Yeah, one of the ugliest wartime realities for the United States will be Japanese-American internment. After Pearl Harbor, racism, panic, and wartime propaganda combined to paint people of Japanese ancestry as inherently suspect. And so Executive Order 9066 opened the door to forced removal, to take more than 100,000 Japanese Americans from mostly the west coast of the United States and put them in interior holding camps, and many of them were American citizens.
And we need to be clear here. There's really no evidence of broad disloyalty that would justify mass incarceration. But yet, families lost homes, farms, businesses. They lost their freedom. They were sent to what officials called relocation centers, but in practice, these were prison camps in remote places.
Right. And there does come a court case, Korematsu v. United States in 1944, where the Supreme Court upheld the exclusion policy. So, what is Executive Order 9066 is upheld essentially by the Supreme Court. It is one of the most infamous wartime civil liberties cases in American history.
Continuity, not a very nice continuity, but we have, the restriction on wartime civil liberties. We've got it in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts. We've got it in 1918 with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and we've got it again here with Executive Order 9066 and Korematsu. So the contradiction, though, gets even sharper when you remember that even as Japanese Americans were being incarcerated, Japanese American soldiers were fighting for the United States. And the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up of largely Japanese Americans, mostly from Hawaii, some of them from the internment camps, they served in Europe, and they became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Let that sink in.
That's crazy.
That's the kind of when you talk about American history, it's full of these contradictions, but that's what makes stories interesting and compelling at the same time that America is kind of falling back against its principles and kind of undermining some of our core basic ideas. Some Americans are still insistent on fighting to preserve those very rights, and they're willing to, go to these extreme lengths to prove their loyalty, their citizenship, and their right to belong. And so we really need to recognize that the contrasts, that we have a democracy at war preaching freedom and fighting against Nazism, while we have some real domestic contradictions and issues that we need to address. So it's not a side note, but it's a really important part of the story of the war.
It is. And there are so many different parts to this war. Let's swing on over to the European theater, shall we?
Let's do it. All right. So we're back in Europe.
You didn't know I was going to do that, did you?
Well, it was a nice transition.
You weren't expecting that.
It's a nice transition. So we're back in Europe, and we've got Roosevelt talking with his military advisors and the British. They don't really agree on exactly the direct path to getting to Nazi Germany. Some Americans, like George Marshall, want this direct cross-channel attack, but the British think we should go around to the edges of the Axis powers first.
So the first major U.S. ground campaigns are going to happen in North Africa, and this is where American troops begin learning this new war in a very difficult way. The Allies land in Morocco and Algeria, and then they move east, and they get pretty bloodied up initially, and then they're going to regroup under leaders like Patton, and finally they're going to help drive Axis forces out of North Korea in 1943.
Right. Then you have Sicily and Italy. So we're moving up through the Mediterranean. Mussolini's regime then collapses, but Italy is not some easy backdoor into Europe. It becomes a grinding campaign at that point. The Allies tie down German divisions there, but they do not race effortlessly north. It's slow, costly, and very messy.
At the same time, the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front is absorbing pretty horrific losses. And this matters because a lot of times we talk about World War II from a Western perspective through the eyes of U.S. and British soldiers and generals and people fighting in Europe. But really, it's what the Soviets were doing on the Eastern Front that caused the Germans to send many of their troops and resources away from the Western Front and toward the Eastern Front. And that's going to lead to the Soviets wanting to have a big voice in how the post-war Europe looks.
And then we're going to have the big moment, the big day, D-Day, and that's exactly what D-Day stands for, just day.
Mm-hmm.
June 6th, 1944, Allied forces are going to land on the beaches of Normandy, France, just across the English Channel, and finally open the long-promised Western Front in France. Because remember, this has been closed since the summer of 1940 when France fell. And so Stalin has been pleading with Roosevelt and Churchill, please open another front. Please, you got to take some of these resources that the Nazis have away from the Eastern Front and bring them over to the West. So that's not the end of the war in Europe, but it's the beginning of the end in the summer of 1944.
I want you to, Ms. Kellner, since you were kind of sharpen your skills on accents, I want you to do a Stalin accent pleading for the Allies to come help.
That's a tough one.
Oh, no.
It'd be something like,
Please, Roosevelt, help Mother Russia. Help Mother... I don't think that's a good idea for me.
It's perfect.
please, comrade.
You're better at that
Say
than I am.
comrade. Comrade, yes, of course. Musket, moose, and squirrel. That's just all Cold War stuff.
Oh, yeah. Natasha.
Yeah, Boris and Natasha.
Boris and Natasha.
But anyway, so from there, the Allies break out of Normandy. Paris is then liberated, and Germany is pushed back. Hitler does he lunge or does he launch? He does both. And one last major counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge, but it fails. So meanwhile, the Soviets close in from the east.
Yeah, and really, the collapse is soon to follow. Hitler is going to commit suicide on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrenders shortly thereafter. Victory in Europe happens. Okay, so when we tell the European story, yes, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, Germany's collapse, but underneath that is this coalition and all the different kind of disagreements and compromises between a strange group of allies, meaning the United States and the Soviet Union in particular.
A place where we don't have any allies and we're fighting alone is going to be the Pacific. And it's also going to be a much different type of warfare. It's not so much of the conventional boots on the ground and bombing campaigns that you necessarily see in Europe, because the Pacific, it has a different geography and a different feel. You know, the U.S. isn't marching across a continent. It's crossing an ocean. And people have described the war in the Pacific to me as like D-Day over and over and over again with the strategy of island hopping.
Yeah, it's because you're hopping around, right? The strategy was not to retake every island that Japan held, but instead the U.S. would bypass some of the heavily fortified positions and then seize only those strategically important islands. Then they would build airfields and naval bases, cut Japanese supply lines, and move step by step closer to Japan itself.
It's really a two-pronged offensive because you've got General MacArthur advancing through New Guinea back toward the Philippines, kind of returning as he said he would, and then you've got Admiral Nimitz who's going to move across the Central Pacific, and together they're going to slowly squeeze the Japanese empire.
And before that advance really takes off, there are going to be some turning points because it does not start off well for the United States in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea is really going to blunt Japanese expansion. And then after that, the Battle of Midway, which I believe is it's in 1942, summer of 1942. Chronology matters. This is a huge victory for the United States because Japan is going to lose 4 aircraft carriers and the momentum really shifts. And then you have Guadalcanal, which is a really long, brutal fight that shows that the United States can go on the offensive and stay there for months on end.
And so by 1945 and 44 and 45 rather, the campaigns get even more intense, going through the Marianas, and I would say Leyte Gulf.
Layet. I thought it was
Is
Layet
it Layet?
Gulf.
Sure. I have no idea.
Leyte
sounds funny.
It does. It's like
sure, let's go with
all
that.
the single ladies. Yeah. But no, okay. So Iwo Jima and then Okinawa. And that wrecks what's left of Japan's ability to wage a major naval war. So Iwo Jima and Okinawa reveal just how lethal an invasion path toward the Japanese home islands is likely to be.
Okinawa in particular matters to help us understand what comes next because there the casualty levels are appalling because we've got Japanese kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks that intensify, and we've got American planners that are looking at this battle and imagining, okay, if this is one island, what's it going to look like when we launch an invasion of the Japanese mainland? So if we want to understand later decisions, we need to think about how brutal this island hopping campaign was in the Pacific.
Mr. Hill?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was enthralled by just the story of island hopping through the Pacific. And yeah.
It sounds more pleasant just saying it out loud, but it was horrific.
It was horrific. And these little volcanic
for spring break,
pieces of rock sticking out of the water.
Spring break, island hopping in the Pacific sounds nice, but 1942 through 1945,
not so much.
Not good.
Yeah, so this brings us to the Manhattan Project. This begins during the war out of fear that Nazi Germany, of course, might develop an atomic weapon before we do, and it becomes one of the most secret and expensive scientific enterprises in history.
And then we have another enormous turning point, moment of silence, Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. And we got the big guy coming in from Missouri, Mr. Harry Truman, becomes
HST.
president, without having fully shared, he was not fully briefed on Roosevelt's wartime knowledge, including the atomic project. So Truman inherits not just a victory in Europe, but one of the most consequential decisions that will ever have to be made in human history.
So we should try to investigate this for just a second as we finish up the episode, because one traditional argument says that Truman used the bomb to force surrender quickly and avoid invasion, which would cost vast numbers of American lives. And this argument points to Japan's fierce resistance, like in Okinawa, and the belief that the war would continue unless something overwhelming happened.
But historians have also raised serious challenges to that view. This is one of the most debated topics in, I think, all of history. You know, some historians argue that Japan was already badly weakened and already moving toward a defeat. Others, historians, emphasize the importance of Soviet entry into the war against Japan in August of 1945. And others argue that the bomb also had diplomatic meanings, you know, implying that it signaled power to the Soviet Union in the emerging post-war order. So in other words, we used the bomb to say, hey, Soviet Union, don't mess with us when this war is over. We were allies for a little bit, but look what we got now. And other historians ask whether racial hatred in the Pacific War shaped American willingness to use such a weapon against Japanese civilians.
So we have this delicate truth that students need to know. You do not honor history by flattening this into a simple, well, it either saves lives, or simple, it was obviously unnecessary. There's so much gray area here. Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, yes. They also killed enormous numbers of civilians and opened the nuclear age. So both things are true.
And that sequence matters. Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Then the Soviets declare war on Japan on August 8th as our ally. Then we bomb Nagasaki on August 9th. And Japan announces surrender on August 14th with a formal surrender on September 2nd.
So there we go. We've ended the war, at least in terms of the military side of it. We kind of still need to go back and talk about what happens on the domestic front. But for now, that's our episode. So thanks for tuning in to APUSH for All. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or YouTube. Leave us a review. And if you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.